how do you want to play the game, which is something I loathe and have loathed for a very long time. And I played the game really well. Once I learned that I couldn't really have an opinion or couldn't share that opinion, I played the game very well, but I still loathe the game.
Welcome to Small Acts of Rebellion, a podcast where the unspoken narratives at the intersection of our personal and professional lives come to light. I'm your host, Heather Pridemore, your guide on this journey of discovery and defiance. Join me as we uncover the rebellious spirit that shapes our careers and lives. It's time to own your story. Are you ready?
Today's guest is Serin Silva, who embodies the spirit of small acts of rebellion in her remarkable journey from Fortune 500 executive to intuitive coach. With over 20 years in the corporate world, including pivotal roles at Williams-Sonoma and Hearst Corporation, Serin's career has been a testament to challenging the status quo and redefining success on her own terms. Serin's rebellious spirit led her to merge her corporate acumen and her ancestral-given intuitive abilities, creating a unique approach to empowering high-achieving women. Her transition from the boardroom to becoming a medium, Reiki master, and certified social emotional coach exemplifies the podcast theme of authenticity and personal growth beyond conventional career paths. As an advocate for transformational change, Serin creates a judgment-free space for clients to reconnect with themselves, accessing innate wisdom often overlooked in the corporate climb. Her work has empowered women to quantum leap to CEO roles, double their earnings, and become change agents within leading companies like Microsoft, Apple, Meta, and Airbnb. Serin's journey of self-discovery and empowerment is captured in her book, You, Empath You, and an anthology published by the LA Writers Collective. Through her website, serinsilva.com, she invites others to join her in challenging the shoulds of corporate culture and embracing a life aligned with personal values and vision. Welcome to the show, Serin.
Hey, Heather, I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. So, Serin and I, we travel in some similar circles, and we recently were on a panel at Denver Startup Week. We did a presentation with a few other ladies that we know called Why Won't They Just Do Their Jobs? And for those who are listening and thinking, like, why would you name your presentation that? There was a punchline. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But Serin and I have been able to have some really interesting conversations about the intersections of personal and professional, and not just from our Denver Startup Week presentation. But I don't know, Serin, I think that's a good place for us to
Yeah,
start today. What do you think?
I love that.
So, in our presentation, it was, of course, it wasn't just us. We had three other panelists with us, and we were all in talking about different sort of case studies or experiences. We were all coming from different industries and talking about scenarios from different points in our career. But the real highlight of the conversation was about empathy and trust and how they can be a real game changer in addressing workplace challenges. So, what I thought would be a great place to start, Serin, is just to recap some of those things that we
Yeah.
talked about. And I really want to understand from your perspective, what are some real world examples where fostering these qualities has directly impacted organizational success?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good and big question. I think when I was in it as a leader, I didn't look at it that way because I was in it and kind of solving for it in real time. What's funny about the business world to me is that we approach it very rationally and very logically, and we don't leave a lot of room for our own wisdom and our humanness to come through. I think these days there's such an emphasis on technology, you know, that we shortcut human relationships and presence and really connecting with our teams. And I think that's why we had so many people at the Denver Startup Week panel. We had crazy reception for an event that happened in the morning in a crowded, packed neighborhood with very little street parking, with leaders there because everyone's trying to figure out how do we motivate people. But the question is almost one question before that, which is who are the people that you're trying to motivate, and who are you when you're with those people and you're trying to motivate them? We don't go internal enough. I'm not here to tell people throw away rational thinking or logic, but I think we've tried to think our way around it and it's not working.
Yeah, I think when we were talking about all of our different perspectives during the
Hmm.
presentation, one of the things that really stood out to me is we sort of make assumptions or take for granted certain situations. And, and I talk to leaders all the time, I'm sure you do
Hmm.
as well, where there's this sort of presumption that certain conversations are had, certain understandings are there, but nobody's actually ever said the thing or done the
Hmm.
thing, or there's no, I don't know, it's like we feel like we checked the box, but we haven't actually done anything in a lot of cases. And so, do you have any stories that you could share from that perspective,
I mean, the
Seren?
first thing I'd say is being direct with someone with compassion, right, is in and of itself a small act of rebellion because there's a conditioning that we need to toe the line and keep things safe. And again, I'm not here to say throw all that out. But what I am saying is there's another way or another thing that you can use to augment your leadership style. So, for an example, well, if I go back to my career, like when I first started working in the advertising industry, I was talking to my manager and she said to me, "You just need to play the game, Serin." Because I was asking questions. I'm like, "Well, there's a more direct route to do this. So why don't we just do that?" And she's like, "Just play the game." And I remember being really annoyed by that because I didn't understand yet the PC nature of all that. But I do think that as a leader, a lot of times I've been the one that's been really direct, right? And sometimes it didn't work. Like I didn't do it right. I didn't do it with enough tact. I didn't do it with enough diplomacy. But once I got it down, it was much smoother. So one example would be there's a lot. Well, one risque example is when I was working for an ad agency, and there was a woman who it was a creative industry, but there was a woman who dressed very provocatively, like beyond like self-expression, kind of like too much was showing and it was creating a distraction and a fervor in the office. And someone actually took a photograph of her and that made its rounds via text to all the males in the office and then created this whole other thing. And I don't want anyone to listen to this and think, well, I should be able to dress where I want. Yes, you should. And I never go up to someone and say, well, you should be wearing pants. That's not really what I'm talking about. But I did have a conversation and say, what are your aspirations? And she's like, I want to go up the ranks. And I was like, I it was a difficult conversation, but I basically had to say the way that you're dressed is creating a distraction, it seems. Here are the facts and the data points to kind of back that up. And how do you want to show up? And how you want to show up, is that in alignment with your plan from a leadership perspective? It was hard. She was wearing a leather bustier, mini skirt, and a thong that was kind of like out of her skirt. And sure, you could say, yeah, she should be able to dress how she wants, but it was creating an issue, and I was the leader, and I also didn't want this woman's reputation to be damaged. I actually knew her to be a very talented, smart young woman who was expressing herself, but it was out of the realm because people were having a reaction to it, right? So that's one example. I've actually had that example happen 3 times in 3 different places because I've worked in really creative industries. And so it is hard to walk a line between freedom of expression and then how to make sure that there's continuity in the business. It's not creating like a disruption. And also, to be honest with you, the reputation piece was important to me. I didn't want, with all 3 of those women, I didn't want them to feel like they weren't being seen through the same lens as what I was seeing and their potential. And I remember kind of going a step further and advocating for one of the employees and saying she can do the work because the perception amongst the male CEO was that she could not. And it was tied to appearance. So, I've always kind of been the one to get in the fire, but I try to do it in a way that honors the other person and where they are and ask questions that are thoughtful and don't put them on the firing squad, right? Like, why are you saying that to me? That's a fail, right? I have to work as a leader to understand where they are versus them having to understand me. It's my job as a leader. I'm in charge of their career. Like every time I've been a leader, I'm always like, I've been given a gift. I'm holding this person's future in my hands, right? And I took that to heart. And I think that's kind of why I went into being a coach because I was really good at that. I love nurturing people and helping them grow, removing obstacles. And then gradually it just went into I wanted to do that all the time. It's just lift people up and help get the stuff out of the way.
There's some really great stuff in there that I want to circle back on, Seren. And so the first thing I just want to point out is when you're talking about being direct and tackling these things head on, I like the word candor, right? Like sometimes you just have to be candid with people about this is the situation, this is what's going on. And what really stood out to me from the story you told, and there's a couple other things I'm going to pull out, but to me, it was you brought some perspective to that person, but you still gave them a
Mm-hmm.
choice. You said, what do you want to accomplish? This is what's happening. This is the perception of what's happening. And like, how does this align with your own personal goals and objectives? And I think that's a really important point to make because when we talk about things like small acts of rebellion or personal expression, then you have to find that balance between where am I okay making these trade offs with the understanding that I'm making a trade off.
Mm-hmm.
And so if someone doesn't know they're making a trade off, that's where I think that candor is really impactful. So that was sort of one thing that stood out to me. The other thing, though, that I thought we could just drill
Mm-hmm.
down into a little bit was the whole idea really of personal expression versus like professional presentation, corporate masking, like whatever you want to call it. And as I'm getting older and wiser, I am now more of a mindset where I do think we have to take some risks, push the envelope, find ways of incorporating our personal expression,
Mm-hmm.
our personal identities into the corporate space. But I'm wondering, Seren, especially since you've had a few of these experiences, what's the balance? Like, how do we figure that out? How do we navigate what is the appropriate level of adopting status quo, right? Like certain types of dressing or showing up in the
Mm-hmm.
workplace versus that personal expression that you were referencing?
I think for me, in my experience, what I felt like is if it creates a reaction in another person, that's where the line is, right? Some sort of response. Like if you want to express yourself, that's great. But if it's, I think it's the same with really good advertising or really good art, funnily enough, because it makes you feel something, right? And so it's complicated. And I had one of the women say, "Well, what should I wear?" And I said, I'm not going to tell you that." And she's like, "I can't afford actually to buy a whole new wardrobe." And I said, "You don't have to." And so we worked through that. I actually told her like go to Target because she had a lot of low cut tops, and I was like, well, if you're going to present, she'd also get really red in a presentation. I'm like, just get a little scarf, a little whatever, just tie it, right? So if that feels right to you, because but I think it's when there's an emotional reaction, it's kind of like, should that be at work? I don't know. Also depends on the context. Are you the creative director? Have you been in the business for 20 years? Right? And you're known for being, or are you really green in the case of the three women that I worked with? And I found with one woman, she was like, no one told me any of this. Like I didn't know. She came from a background where her mom didn't say like, you got to kind of be a little whatever, right? She had no guidance. Mother was very
Hmm.
hands off. And so when she was working with me, it was kind of like she was hearing it for the first time. And it's challenging for me too, because I don't want to tell her what to do, but she also was asking for help. So I was like, okay, how do I lean in and then check and say, are you okay? Like, how does this feel to you? And I think that's really important. Like, how does this feel to you? Right? Because if it doesn't feel good to her, that's also not a good reaction, right? If other people are having a reaction and she doesn't feel comfortable, it still doesn't work. So I think context is important, amount of experience, industry can sometimes. I agree with you that the time is ripe for some change in these environments. And I think that's why over my career, these women have shown up because it is time for it to change. But it's hard, it also has to do with what your career aspirations are as well. How do you want to play the game, which is something I loathe and have loathed for a very long time. And I played the game really well. Once I learned that I couldn't really have an opinion, or couldn't share that opinion, I played the game very well, but I still loathe the game. So I think for me, helping these folks based on where they want to go in their career with the three women that I mentioned, I was showing them how to play the game to get to what they wanted. I didn't agree with the game, but I was showing them something that I hadn't gotten.
Something I was thinking as you were talking, Seren, is that especially for women in the workplace, when it comes to like dressing, when there's that reaction,
Mm-hmm.
let's just say in the office, that can also be, unfortunately, a little bit of some sexist connotation, right? And I guess what I really want to say is that there are factors that we're all up
Mm-hmm.
against in life and
Mm-hmm.
work, and some of them are
Mm-hmm.
unfair, and yet we're still beholden to them. And so I think it goes back to what we were saying just before, Seren, where it really has to be about understanding the trade-offs that you're making. I mean, there was a time where certain choices that I made were
Mm-hmm.
negotiable, right? Let's just pick something less controversial. My hair,
Okay.
okay? I had blue highlights in high school because I knew once I got a real job, I was not going to be able to have fun colored hair anymore. I have always liked fashion colors. I'm going to be 41 this year. So if that gives you any perspective on how long I've loved fashion colors, it's been a long
Uh-huh.
time. And it's only been recently as an adult that I've fully embraced the last couple of years. I've had fashion color hair, but I existed in a corporate environment for over a decade and always had brown, blonde, auburn, just coloring within the lines because at that point in my life, that was a negotiable.
Mm-hmm.
I would say for where I am now in my life, that is a
Mm-hmm.
non-negotiable. I get to do what I want with my hair when I want to, and no one else is going to tell me when, where, or how much. I can cut it as short as I want. I can grow it as long
Mm-hmm.
as I want. I can make it any color that
Yeah.
I want. I could shave it off if I want. It's just a non-negotiable for me. I'm not willing to have a conversation about my hair because at this point in my life, it's become too much part of how I see myself, how I identify
Mm-hmm.
in the world. And so I think if you want to wear a leather bustier to work and you want to make that part of your work attire, first of all, I'm here for it, slay. But you could throw a little blazer on with that and still play the
Yeah.
game, quote unquote. I don't know. I just, anytime it comes to especially clothing, and this is a total tangent for
That's
us,
okay.
Saran, about clothing, but
Okay.
clothing was not one of our topics. But whenever it comes to clothing, especially, so much of our identity and expression shows up in the things that we
Yes.
wear, the way we do, if you wear
Mm-hmm.
makeup or hair,
Mm-hmm.
tattoos, like piercings, whatever it is. All those things become part of the self-expression. And I can tell you, and you know this about me, but like when I was having my health issue and I could only wear sneakers to executive
Mm-hmm.
meetings, that was really hard for me. Sneakers was not part of my identity, and it made me feel less confident in the things I wore to work. Even though I worked in the tech industry,
Mm-hmm.
everybody wears sneakers,
Right.
like in the tech industry. Executives wear sneakers and sport coats and jeans. Like
Right.
it's totally within the realm of appropriate attire. But for me, sneakers didn't feel appropriate and it made me feel less confident. And so at the intersection of all this is the personal and the professional. It's like there's a certain expectations within the work environment. There's also a lot of shoulds. You should wear this, you should wear that. I mean, there was a time when women were told that if you went to court, you had to wear pantyhose. I personally never want to wear pantyhose.
Pantyhose are a disaster. It's very constraining. Very constraining.
you might you might see me in some tights in the winter, but I'm not doing
Yeah.
pantyhose.
It's really challenging, you know. I want people to be as free as possible. I really do, truly. I want people to be seen for who they are. And for the ad agency industry, it was really because it was a professional services type of thing where people were meeting with clients. That was sort of the challenge. But I mean, I would, if my company was bigger, I'd probably be like, wear whatever the hell you want, just do a great job at the work and show up. Like I personally, especially because I'm around. I've been around creative people for 20 something years. My husband's an artist. My daughter's an artist. She's got a different thing going on all the time. I've defended her to family for the way she looks, you know, so that she can have her own self expression. And it's difficult. You know, I think what's nice is we're at a stage now where some of what you raised around hair color and chosen identity has more of a presence. 20 years ago, the conversation wasn't happening at all. And now we're in this funny place that's uncomfortable for all of us. But for me, the uncomfortable means it's going to change. Whether it wants to or not, generations after me, they're like, yeah, we're not doing that. And I'm like, yeah, don't. And if you told them play the game right now, they'd probably be like, I'm not doing that. I'm doing me. Right. So I think there is some beauty in the mess as we try to do this in a way that is respectful, honorable, honors the person who is doing the work. Right. It's slippery. And also all the issues with women, around their appearance. I mean, we could have a whole 3 sessions of podcast just on that. My hair's straight today. I have very curly hair. I felt like making it straight. No one told me to. But it's amazing to me that sometimes people, when they see my hair straight after they've seen it curly, they're like, oh, your hair looks so nice today. And I'm like, what are you reacting to? What does that mean? And recently I've just become aware of it, like that my hair is this topic of conversation that I didn't ask for, right? But for me, it's expression. Like today, I wanted like this. I'm on the podcast. I'm like, I want to look good. I like it this way today. I woke up wanting it this way today. But tomorrow might be just totally big and curly, right? Because I want to be able to have the choice to show up how I want to show up, as you mentioned, which I think also builds, I think we're going to talk about next, which is around trust. Like if I show up and I honor the person and connect with them authentically at where they are and listen to what they have to say, that's how we build trust.
I was actually going to take a little bit of a pivot,
Sure.
Serin, because one of the other things that I hear coming out of where our conversation's
Yeah.
snaking through is actually about boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I think we're both getting at is there are some things that are acceptable and some things that are
Mm-hmm.
unacceptable. Then there are the things for ourselves that are negotiable and
Mm-hmm.
non-negotiable. And then there's all these like norms,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we're just like navigating within this sort of soup
Mm-hmm.
of context and nuance. But when we talk about things like choices or like empathy and trust, there's also this other component of
Mm-hmm.
boundaries. And we often hear about the need to be open in the workplace to build trust, right? But can there be too much of a good thing? And so I want to know how you think about how you think oversharing might contribute to the burnout that we're seeing among employees, because I know this is like kind of a passion area for you to talk about.
I did a talk on this a couple weeks ago. So I'll say this first. I was raised without any boundaries. My parents told me everything that was going on all the time in living full color. And so I didn't learn them until I became an adult. And it was not fun to learn it that way. My parents come from a different culture, I get it, but it's just not the way this culture functions. It's also not super healthy, right? So I think that's probably why I feel so passionate about it, because I didn't feel like I had agency to say that's too much, or I don't want to do that, or that doesn't feel good to me, right? So as an adult, I think that also may be why I'm so darn direct and feel comfortable there, because I'm like, let's just cut to the chase and get to the point. But my thoughts on oversharing, it's a big question because on the one hand, I want people to feel super comfortable. On the other hand, these technology platforms have been created. It means constant message in your face across multiple modalities and platforms. And that was created for efficiency. I don't know if it was created to facilitate all of the oversharing. And in working with some of my clients who are senior leaders and executives, they want to do the right thing and listen to their employees, but it's gotten to the point where it's become a huge distraction and taken away from the work, because in smaller mid-sized organizations there's only so many people to do the work, and executives want to have a strong connection with that small or mid-sized team, and so they know everyone pretty well. The challenge is that there are certain things that are for work and there are certain things that are not for work. And I think this is why we're seeing a rise of companies wanting to offer mental health benefits and mental health platforms kind of starting, because there has been so much that we've all collectively been through. And I'm not here to tell anyone like your pain is not valid or you're not allowed to share how you feel about something. But there is, like with everything, there is a balance, right? What I also want to say is good leaders, they care about you. I know because they pay to work with me so I can help them navigate how they're dealing with the oversharing and how to support their employees and what kind of support systems to build in. But boundaries is definitely a key part of it. And it's tough for the leader. They want to be their authentic self. They want to show up. They want to connect. But they've got to put boundaries as far as time boxing. I had a client who was telling me that their one-on-ones are going 2.5 hours with one employee. And the employee was very upset about some stuff that had happened in the company and was having personal issues and would come in and didn't have like an agenda of like what they wanted to talk about, which it's like, hey, you got to come in and give me an update on what you're working on because we pay you to do certain things that you've agreed to do as a function of your job. And so it turned into these like 2 hour, 2.5 hour sort of almost like rant slash therapy sessions. And the employee was a talented employee. It wasn't like, oh, they were a poor performer and they had an axe to grind, so they just wanted. It was not that. They're just going through a lot and needed support. And then they would also go and tell a lot of people on the team what was going on. And the challenge is there's no end to that, right? Without boundaries, there's no bookend. It just keeps going and going and going until it's resolved in some way, right? And the resolution without boundaries, if it gets to the point where you're not getting your work done, it means you're going to probably not be there for that long. Or it can really be exhausting for the CEOs trying to motivate and galvanize the team to meet their objectives, which, by the way, is what supplies the paycheck and the benefits and all the good stuff. So as much as we're like, well, you don't have time for me because it's all about money, well, it's business. So unless it's a nonprofit or volunteer organization, there's a correlation between your work and making the company money, which then some of the money comes to you. So I know we all inherently know this, but I think when we're really emotionally charged and we got to get it out, we forget that or we get angry about that. And so oftentimes I'll work with folks to also, what are some other outlets that we can use to help you with whatever's going on? A lot of times they'll say, do you have a therapist? What's your ability to access a therapist? But then also I lean into like somatics. So what's going on with your body? Where are you holding tension? I like to incorporate movement, go for a walk. There's a reason why people love walking meetings because you're getting it out. Just like when you go to de-stress from exercise, it's the same thing for work. So what are other things that we can push on? But I do think it's important for both leaders and employees to kind of understand what their personal boundaries are, what the company's boundaries are, and kind of where those.
There's a couple things I'd like to speak a little bit more on with you,
Mhm.
Seren. So the first one, which you just alluded to, is that like when there's this lack of boundaries, I mean, you're actually mostly talking about the person who is experiencing, let's say, some kind of
Mhm.
personal impact, and they're bringing that to the
Mhm.
workplace. But I want to flip it to the other shoe a little bit
Sure.
and talk about the leaders who are handling these conversations. Because to your point, I actually just worked with someone recently who was like, my I love my team, but I'm exhausted because what they need from me is not what I'm necessarily good at. And so they were saying that all the employees were coming and bringing all these other things to the mix. And it's the leader was trying to take care of their people. They were trying to address like all of the things, but things were getting too far away from center, which of course center is the work.
Mhm.
And so I just want to focus there just for
Mhm.
a second because you kind of have some different schools of thought, I think, in leadership. Some leaders are just very much like all about the work all the time. Like, I don't care about you like your personal life. I don't care about what you did over the weekend. I don't care about your kid's soccer game, like none of that. I think that's one end of the spectrum and not necessarily one I recommend. And then I think where we can get to the other end of the spectrum is something that Kim Scott from Radical Candor has coined as ruinous empathy. And
Yeah.
so it's sort of like where you're taking all of it on, and so that's the other extreme, another end of the pole that I don't
Yeah.
recommend. And so for leaders, it sounds like the sweet spot is going to be somewhere in the
Yeah.
middle, right? Like you want to care about people. And yes, we cannot completely divide our professional and personal lives because work is a part of our personal life, and things that happen outside of work do
Mhm.
impact our ability to come to work
Mhm.
and do a good job and show up in the right way. So there's this weird sort of muddled space in the middle where we have this combination of like some personal stuff, mostly professional stuff. And I don't know, do you have any like thoughts from like a leadership perspective,
Yeah.
Seren, on how we navigate those boundaries of like caring, but then also sort of holding some structure in place so that we don't slide off into ruinous empathy?
I love that term ruinous empathy because it can be ruinous for everyone, not just the leader or the employee. But the tools that I've used with a couple of clients, because this issue came up with 2 or 3 clients over the same 6 month period, which did give me pause and made me wonder what was going on up there. But the first was, what are your boundaries and agreements with the employee? If you're having a one on one, you need to say, bring me an agenda. This is what we're going to go over. This is how much time we have. I have 30 minutes for you. These are 30-minute meetings, right? And as women leaders, which is mostly who I work with, they were like, well, I don't, they were really upset. Yes, but there's an agreement. And so it's like, how are they showing up and how are you directing and speaking up? Despite what may be going on with them, how are you creating and holding the container with those agreements? Because they're agreements. My agreement is I show up to work, I do the best I can, you pay me. As a leader, it's like my agreement is to try to run this company as best as I can and deliver profit, right? So that you can continue working here and I can continue working here. So, given those responsibilities, how are you showing up as a leader? And I'm like, well, I'm really busy, and I'm like, no, you have to find time. Otherwise, you're going to keep losing 2.5 hours a week. And then I quantified that for them and said, this is what it's costing. If we were roughly take your salary and what the bill rate is, this is how much this is costing. Once I quantified it for the leader and said, this is what it's costing the company, they were like, whoa, right? So you've got to speak up. And the other thing, which we spoke about when we did the Denver Charter, is we're not a family. That's where the line is. I may think you are awesome and I love having you as on my team and all of that, but we're never going to be a family. This is a transactional relationship. As much as I hate having those words come out of my mouth because it connects to that leader that you mentioned that is doesn't care about your weekend or your dog or the fact that your grandma's dead or whatever it is. I don't like those people, I'll be honest with you. I don't get it and I don't like it and I don't want to be like it and I don't want to coach anybody like that because I can't. I'm like, you got to have some humanity, right? But there is a transaction that is happening every 2 weeks. So, kind of saying we're not a family. And I actually worked with the employees, the CEO and the employees, to kind of say this is what the boundaries are and let's put some processes and structure in place. I get it's a startup creative environment, highly innovative, but we need to take a pause. And so that's another thing that I like to really bring in, which is in this era of oversharing, high platform availability to put out whatever you want into the world, however you feel, what are the guardrails? And I'd also like to say, which is something I could do a whole other podcast on, I love technology, but when we brought it into the world, we didn't think about the ramifications. And we're all feeling that now, right? And so by putting boundaries in for the executive or the leader, it's setting an expectation for how the technology should be used. It's setting for an expectation for how they should engage. And it's also good for you to say, it's good for me to know that you're having a really hard time. How are you resourced or, what kind of services, can we provide? As a leader, you really don't want to take on their emotional pain for a myriad of reasons. The one that I'm most concerned about is your own health, right? We just keep taking in and ingesting all this pain. Over time, it has an effect. I'm living proof of that. We're not going to talk about that today either, but I'm living proof of that. And I know you've had some experiences as well. So the boundaries are for everyone and they're good for everyone. And I just also want to say it's really hard out there. I get it. You know, I am glad that therapy is really talked about in open forum now. And I'm also aware that there's generational differences in how we lead. And our new leaders that are showing up, what I love about them is the women that I work, they show up as like full heart, very compassionate. They want to do better than the corporation of old, right?
One thing I'd like to pivot a little bit on, Seren, because when you first brought this topic to LinkedIn, which is where I saw the clip from your recent podcast about the oversharing and the burnout, I shared a slightly different
Mm-hmm.
perspective. And so I thought it might be fun for us to
Yeah.
talk about this perspective as well, in the fact that I actually see sometimes the oversharing as a sign of burnout.
Ah.
And here's what I mean. I'll share a personal experience first, and then I'll share how I came to this reflection. So, when I was still in my corporate job near the very end, feeling very burnt out, but not realizing how burnt out I was, probably a little bit depressed, but not realizing I was depressed, right? Like just not in a good
Yeah.
headspace, just all the way around. I think at the time, I knew something was off. Everything felt like I was trying to hold it all together, but things were leaking out, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. And so I had this really awkward conversation with a senior executive where my intention was just to try to help them understand me better, to connect with me more, to maybe communicate. I don't know what, because it's been a while since I had that conversation. But I know that when I left that conversation, I knew when I left it, it would like it had not been a good conversation and I had overshared.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say that much. I had overshared. Most of it was not work related in reflection, but in my mind it was connected, right? It was work related because I was trying to explain who I am and how I'm motivated, but I wasn't necessarily articulating those connections well. I was just sort of telling
Mm-hmm.
things. Okay? So we'll say that. More recently, I was dealing with someone who probably was in a similar mind state as the one I had been in. And they were telling me that they were feeling uncomfortable at their job. And I said, "What's making you uncomfortable?" Everything they answered had nothing to do with their role, the company. Like it was all this stuff from their past. But the reason I think this is relevant is because as I was listening and watching and interpreting, I was realizing that the problem was there was a misalignment in values and expectations between them and the
Mm-hmm.
company that they were working for. And that in their mind, this sort of past experience was like making connections with their present moment. If I had been their boss, what am I supposed to do with that
Right.
information? Because I can't undo the
Right.
past. And I could also say to some degree, what does it have to do with what we're talking about right
Mm-hmm.
now, which is work? But I will say that as they were telling me their story, what I saw was the signs of burnout, the signs of misalignment, the signs of someone who was struggling to try to force themselves to fit in a place where they didn't. And so I believe from my own experience that probably for them too, at the time, there was a connection between what they were saying and what they were thinking and feeling and experiencing that were work related. But I actually think the fact that they overshared and things were seeping out that
Yeah.
were maybe less directly related was actually the sign
Right.
of a problem.
Okay.
So I don't know if you've seen this, but this has just been my own recent. I had an experience and then I saw it from the outside looking in and it was like, "Oh gosh, now I can only imagine what that senior executive was thinking as they sat across from me during that discussion because I was just oozing everywhere." But it was really a sign of, unfortunately, a less than perfect mental state.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, so sometimes I'll listen to recordings, and I was sent a recording, and she was angry with the CEO, and some frustration was coming in, and she had me have a listen to it to provide her a perspective with how she came across. And then I gave her some feedback and some tools on what to do next time. But I think to bring her back to burnout, I think things get very messy and very muddy in our head. And what no one ever talks about is like we're all raised so differently. We all have our own blueprint and experience. And then we get together in the workplace and we collide. Then you add all the stress of our job, if our values aren't aligned, if the expectations aren't clear. I mean, it's a real soup. It's no wonder that doesn't happen actually more, right? And when you get really frustrated, things get really, really muddy. And let's say your boyfriend broke up with you, or let's say you've got a sick family member, that just layers on to get, and it makes it very hard to see straight. And those are the things that unfortunately can really damage a career sometimes, depending on who the executive was that you were sharing and what their ability to handle receiving the information is. I can count on two hands the times I have done that early in my career, because I came from a family where everyone was blurting what was going on with them with no boundaries. And it cost me a couple times. Fortunately, I had some really compassionate leaders, but I had to learn the hard way, like when to just shut up and when is it a work problem and when it is it a family problem and when can I just say there's just a lot of stuff going on at home and just leave it at that so that they have the context or the cue. The leader has the cue to say, okay, there's more heaviness with that person right now. So maybe I should just think about if I'm going to give them another project right now or if they can handle with what they've got, and if it's significant load, what kind of support do they need? And I think if you've got a good HR partner, I think that's where those things kind of come into play. I hate the trial by fire way of learning. And I think that's another reason why I like to coach people, which is like, well, let's work with that. Is that a work problem? That's why we do detailed sort of intake and context, because I want to know where you've been and where you've traveled. I want to know what's happened to you. It's important.
Oh, I love that, Serin. So in my own coaching practice, I talk about how stories are what shape our
Hmm.
careers. And to just, I mean, you just so eloquently said it, but like where we've been and what we've experienced is so that context is so important to understanding where we are right now and how we get to the next step.
Hmm.
And people don't give enough credit to the fact that like those stories do shape our
Hmm.
journeys, and on the surface, it's very logical, right? Our stories shape our context and our experiences, right? Seems pretty
Hmm.
self explanatory. Yet many of us don't stop to say, how does this story impact how I've gotten to where I am, the choices that I made to get here, and the things that I need to do to overcome, to keep
Hmm.
to get to that
Hmm.
next step, that next phase? And I don't know. Thank you. That was
You're welcome.
gorgeous.
It's funny because a lot of times when I was talking to a well-known group yesterday about expanding my practice and being part of their coaching. One of the things she asked me was like, "Well, what tools do you use? What assessments?" And I listed off the assessments that I'm certified in. But I'll be honest with you, the assessments are not the answer. The assessments can help excavate or bring some of where they've been to light. But if you hang too much on those, you're just kind of putting a band-aid on the person and then coaching them and sending them out, right? And I say this, within reason, right? Some people, they just need a little tweak in coaching, and so an assessment can really be a like a completion point or the topper to get them where they need to go. But most of the time, there's a lot of goo, and the way I look at goo is through a environmental kind of lens, which is a stage of like butterflies, right? When you first start out, you're just goo, right? Then you have the pupa and you're in there growing, but no one can really help you out, right? Because if you were to actually put your hand inside the chrysalis, you'll hurt the butterfly to help them. So they're in there trying to figure out how to get out. Got to meet them where they are. If I handed that, this is a goofy example, but if I handed that butterfly an assessment, they'd be like, "Here's all the trees in the forest that you're gonna go fly when you get out." They'd be like, "I don't care what tree. Like I'm just trying to get out of the goo so I can get to where I'm going, right?" And so I often try to lean to like things in nature as a way of kind of explaining what happens with humans. But I think we're a lot more complicated than the machines and the assessments allow.
So fair. I use an assessment in my practice as well, and I use it as a place to ground our initial
Hmm.
conversation. And so it's using it as a tool to understand a level of self-awareness, a level of
Hmm.
perspective, and to get at some of those stories, because as people start to reflect on aspects of the human condition, then they start to tell you those stories that tie to those important factors that you need to understand where they've been and ultimately where they're trying to go. But your connection to nature seems like a great segue to another topic that I want to discuss with you, Seren. And so the show is about the intersection of the personal and the professional. And I've actually said it on this particular episode a handful of times. Given your extensive background in corporate and spiritual realms, And considering that in most places they're often kept separate, I really want to understand how you see them intersecting. And this to me is the point in our conversation where this starts to get a little bit more personal about you,
Sure.
Seren. So hopefully you're comfortable going down this road.
I am. I'm very comfortable, actually. As of last week, I'm very comfortable. I unmasked myself last week and brought the two worlds together. And I know you and a colleague, met a couple weeks ago, and I talked about being stuck between these two places, and it was either you or the other woman that said it's like a trapeze, and I held on to that imagery of like, well, yeah, you can't get to the next place if you're just hanging on the one trapeze bar. And so there was some shift that happened, and I decided to embrace and bring those together consciously as opposed to keeping them apart, which I think is a rebellious act, if I'm being honest. And that was the theme of the podcast. But yeah, so I didn't know I had intuitive abilities. I didn't know that it was in my family, like lineage, until later. My husband brought it to my attention. Like, he said, "You're in psychic." And I said, "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." I took myself very seriously as an advertising executive and someone who clawed their way from the bottom as, immigrant, child of immigrants, and who was always outspoken. And so I played the game, and like I said, I played it well, and at some point, the intuitive stuff, I mean, it's why I moved to Colorado, was basically on intuition. I left San Francisco for Colorado, and I didn't even know at that point that I was intuitive. But when I moved to Colorado, everything started opening up for me, and I trusted something outside myself or within myself, depending on how you look at it, and took a risk. I was ready for a risk. And last week, I was also ready for a risk to just say, this is who I am and this is what I do. So when we talk about the intersection, I see people as a whole person having a human experience. Work is a piece of that. It's an important piece, but it's not your whole being. And I think all of us, whether we use intuitive or psychic or my gut or I think, whatever the word is, we have an inner knowing. And that inner knowing, there was actually a book written, I don't know, 20 years ago about this. So every animal has some sort of defensive ability, right? So like skunks can skunk you, snakes will bite you and they can have venom. This person says human beings, our superpower, our innate like defense is actually our intuition. So this thing that everyone's like, oh, that's woo, and like, where did that come from? And oh, hey, guess what? You're hardwired with that. I'm hardwired with that, and you're hardwired with that. And when you have a really great idea or inspiration, that's where it's coming from. I'm not here with the big wizard outfit and like a wand to like, and there's people who are into that, and that's fine. Again, I'm not here to tell people what to do. I'm here as a guide. But to me, I see it as one world, and I don't want them separate anymore. And I believe that we're in challenging times. And the reason we're in challenging times, that's a whole nother podcast, but we need to be using all of our tools and all of our wisdom, all of our knowledge that's baked into us. When we know something feels right, we know something feels wrong. That is your intuition. And you're not going to find that in a book. You're just not, right? Sure, you can learn things and have work experiences, and all of that is your wisdom, all of it. But why would you leave this really ephemeral piece out of that? It's like leaving money on the table. Why wouldn't you tap into your gut? So for me, I was like, yeah, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going to pretend that as a coach that part doesn't exist. I'm just not doing it. It doesn't feel authentic to me, and I use it as a skill, and I work with my clients, and I bring it in where they can grasp it, right? But yeah, I just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't lie anymore to make other people feel better. Well, that's woo stuff, sir. We don't talk about that. Oh, so if I think this is a bad idea, and then I research it competitively, and then I find out that it's a bad idea, and I validate what I thought, or I just shortcut that, don't even do the research, and we take it right to testing. I'm not supposed to do that because that's woo and it makes you think I'm a fairy or something. It's like, that's a waste of time. And if you look at Steve Jobs and Richard Branson and Oprah, think of any sort of luminary, and you do a little bit of digging, including Einstein, they will all talk to you about intuition. But yet, for some reason, it's magical. And that just kind of blows my mind. I'm just like, just use what you know. Or you're probably already using it, you don't even know that that's what that is. So I get a little about that because I think I let myself for 10 years listen to what other people thought, and I let other people define me so that I could be validated. And I believed somehow that if I didn't bring that, if I kept that piece out, I would be safe and clients would hire me. When the reality is I don't need to worry about that. I know my shit.
Let me ask you this,
Yeah,
Seren. When you were let's just I don't know. Let me set it up this way. This may not be an accurate
yeah.
description, but when you were living a double life, you were like corporate coach extraordinaire by day and spiritual intuitive guru by
Yeah.
night. Was it truly a compartmentalize, like I'm living these two different like things, or was it really more about an outward presentation of like you were sort of already living them internally because that's who you are, and the real risk and the big embrace that you've taken, the unmasking that you recently did, do you feel like that was more public, or has something internally actually shifted and you're truly like integrating?
Something actually shifted.
Okay.
I'm really good at living compartmentally, and that's another
Aren't we
podcast.
all?
So we're not doing that. But yeah, something within me changed. There's a famous quote. I'm gonna butcher it, but it's like the time came when the risk to stay a bud and blossom. It's by Anaïs Nin. I wish I could really remember it, but keeping yourself small takes a lot of energy. And I was small and I was freaking frustrated. And I was really excited about all these gifts that I have. And I felt like I couldn't say anything and I couldn't be myself. And I could either stay that way for the rest of my life or I could just be like, fuck it. And so I went to this retreat, this women's retreat that I know the two creators of. And we did some deep inner work. And I was hired as the ceremonialist. So one of the things I just got certified in is I can do non-religious ceremonies. And the way I look at ceremonies is you're marking a moment. It can be any kind of moment. It can be a personal moment. You can have a personal ceremony with yourself if you want to. So they had hired me to do the closing ceremony. And so I was at this beautiful estate in Sonoma. I don't know how I found myself there, but the world is amazing. I was up on this bluff with 30 women, and we had done a lot of inner work. So I had them write down what they wanted to release into the fire from themselves and what they wanted to call in and bring into themselves, right? And while I was doing that, I was like, this just feels too damn good. Like, this is me, right? I can be all these things. I can be the businesswoman. I can be the coach. We can, right? So I gave myself permission, and now I feel very like committed to like working with other people and giving them permission because that's where our joy comes from. It's not going to come from buying a lot of stuff. It's not going to come from a really awesome Instagram profile has lots of followers. Like when you die, they're not, I swear to God, I don't think they're going to stand up and be like, you had 50,000 Instagram followers. Like she was amazing, right? It's going to be like those moments, right? So, that's kind of what happened. So the shift was, I just couldn't take it anymore. And it felt too good to be myself. And so I just said,
I think that was I don't know. I felt like I needed that message for some reason today, Seren. So, especially the bud analogy, something about that really resonates with me for my where I'm at today. So, thank you
you're
for
welcome.
sharing
You're
that.
welcome. It feels good to talk about it. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. Because I want
I'm excited
Thank
for
you.
you. I told you this when we talked before, but I am someone who loves to see things that people say like, "Oh, this and that don't go together." And I love when people can take these sort of contrasting elements and combine them in new and novel ways. To me, that's the real heart of innovation, but it's also what makes each of our stories like unique and makes each of us like special is whatever that combination is. And so for you, that combination is that I'm a very serious corporate business lady. And then I'm also spiritual and intuitive and woo woo for,
Mhm.
for lack of a better term. And so I think that I'm really interested to see as you further integrate and as you really lean in to this like next chapter, how those things come together for you and what that results in. So
Thank you. Thank you.
congratulations.
I honestly, I want people to be as free as they want to be. That really motivates me. I think it motivates me because as a child, I felt pretty oppressed, to be honest. And so I feel like I want to just go and lift, okay, bye, lift, okay, bye, like go be awesome. And when I first started coaching, I had this crazy visual of a kaleidoscope. And I couldn't make sense of it for a while. And I was like, oh, well, when you look at a kaleidoscope, every little frame is beautiful, right? And so if we unlock people, you're unlocking this beautiful pattern of like humanity, really. And that's really what motivates me to do the work.
That's another lovely analogy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Serin, we are coming to the end of our show, and I love to wrap every episode by saying, if someone was like, this episode was way too long, I did not listen. What is like one thing you'd want them to take away from our conversation?
You are loved. The world wants your authenticity. And don't let other people tell you who you are. You get to decide who you are.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. Thank you,
You're
Serin.
welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed our
Thanks
conversation.
for having me, Heather. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this episode and are seeking to redefine success on your own terms, subscribe to Small Acts of Rebellion and join a community that celebrates authenticity and personal growth.
Okay.